By the second week of November, the Wyoming wind had stripped every soft thing from the land. It combed the high grass flat against the earth. It worried the cottonwoods along Bitter Creek until their bare limbs clicked through the night. It came down from the Absaroka Range with ice in its breath and pressed against the Ward Ranch as if it meant to pry every board loose and scatter the pieces clear to Nebraska. Elias Ward had lived beneath that wind for 12 years. He knew the sounds it made. The low moan at the chimney meant snow before morning. A sharp whistle through the north wall meant the chinking had cracked again. Silence meant the worst cold, the kind that settled over the valley beneath a white sky and froze water inside a covered pail. He prepared for each kind without complaint. Before dawn, he broke ice in the troughs. He fed the mares, counted the cattle in the lower pasture, and carried split pine from the shed to the porch. At dusk, he checked every latch twice. His movements were steady and exact. Nothing was wasted. Not daylight, not grain, not words. The house had once been built for noise. It had 3 bedrooms, a broad kitchen, and a parlor with windows facing west. Now, Elias used only the kitchen and the narrow room beside it. He kept the other doors closed. Dust softened their handles. In the parlor, a sheet covered the piano, and a framed photograph lay face down in the top drawer of a walnut table. People in Dry Creek said solitude had made him hard. They were wrong. Hard things did not ache when touched. Elias had simply learned to arrange his days so that nothing reached the tender places. That autumn, one of those arrangements began to fail. His ranch cook, old Mr. Pritchard, left for Missouri after receiving word that his sister had taken ill. 2 hired hands followed the railroad south in search of warmer work. Elias could mend fence alone. He could move cattle alone if he took his time, but meals became coffee, salt pork, and biscuits dense enough to hold down a roof shingle. At the Mercantile, he wrote an advertisement in block letters and pinned it beside notices for a lost mule and a church supper. Cook and housekeeper wanted at Ward Ranch, fair wage, private quarters, winter employment, possibly longer. He nearly crossed out private quarters. Then he remembered the empty rooms and left the words where they were. 9 days passed without an answer. On the 10th, as a gray afternoon folded early over the valley, Elias saw a wagon stopped near the south gate. One wheel leaned at a sick angle. A small bay horse stood with its head down, steam lifting from its back. Beside the wagon, a woman in a brown coat was trying to drag a trunk through the frozen ruts. The wind caught her skirt and shoved her sideways. She planted both boots, waited for the gust to pass, and pulled again. Elias rode toward her. She looked up before he spoke. She seemed close to 30, though weariness had drawn shadows beneath her eyes. Her dark hair was pinned under a plain felt hat, and one gloved hand held a folded newspaper. "Mr. Ward?" "Yes." She lifted the paper. His advertisement had been circled in pencil. "My name is Mara Ellison. I came about the work." Elias looked at the broken wheel, then toward the clouds gathering over the western ridge. "You came from Dry Creek in that?" "From farther than Dry Creek. Snow will be here before dark. Then I suppose we ought to move quickly." There was no challenge in the words, only fact. Elias tied the bay behind his horse and transferred the trunk to his buckboard. Mara carried a cloth satchel herself. When he reached for it, she tightened her grip. "It is not heavy." He did not argue. They reached the ranch as the first flakes crossed the yard. Mara stood at the hitching rail and studied the house, the barn, and the dark line of hills beyond the pastures. Her face gave away little. Elias wondered what she had expected and whether the place had disappointed her. Inside the kitchen, the stove gave weak heat. A pan from breakfast sat where he had left it. 2 cracked plates waited beside the wash basin. Mara took in the room with one slow glance. "How many men do I cook for?" "2, counting me." 3 when Tomas rides over from the North Range. "Bread every day?" "If you can." "Laundry?" "Mine. Sometimes bedding from the bunkhouse." "Sunday work?" "Only meals and what cannot wait." She nodded. The wage in the notice. $8 a week. Room and board. Paid every Saturday. Yes. Only then did she remove her gloves. Her fingers were red from cold. A pale mark circled the 3rd finger of her left hand, though no ring remained there. Elias looked away. "The bunkhouse is empty," he said. "It has a stove." Mara turned toward the window. Through blowing snow, the long roof of the barn was barely visible. "I can sleep in the barn," she said. "There is no need to put yourself out." Elias glanced at her satchel, at the damp hem of her dress, and at the careful way she kept herself near the door. "The animals have the barn," he said. "Supper is at 6. He carried her trunk inside but did not take it farther than the entry. Then he went upstairs without explanation. The spare room at the end of the hall had not been opened in 3 years. Elias stood with his hand on the knob until the cold brass warmed beneath his palm. When he finally entered, the room smelled of cedar, dust, and the faint lavender his sister Ruth used to tuck into the drawers. The bed was covered with a white sheet. A blue pitcher sat on the washstand. On the wall hung a small sampler stitched by a girl who had never lived long enough to finish its border. He opened the window a crack and beat dust from the rug. He carried in 2 armloads of wood, filled the water pitcher, and lit the little iron stove. From a chest in the hall, he took clean quilts and a pillow that had gone flat from years of storage. He replaced it with one from his own bed. When Mara came upstairs, he was tightening the loose screw on the door latch. "This room will hold heat," he said. "The privy is behind the woodshed. There is a basin downstairs if the pitcher freezes." She stopped on the threshold. Firelight moved across the quilt and the polished blue pitcher. Her eyes rested on the clean towel folded at the foot of the bed. Then they found Elias. "Your notice said private quarters." "It did. I thought you meant the bunkhouse." "I did too." For a moment, the wind pressed against the window and made the glass tremble. Mara placed her satchel inside. "Thank you, Mr. Ward." Elias nodded once and went downstairs before gratitude could become a conversation. That first supper was burned potatoes, salt pork, and coffee. Mara had arrived too late to prepare anything else. She ate without remark. Afterward, she washed the plates, while Elias read an old livestock circular by lamplight. The next morning, he woke to the smell of yeast. Mara stood at the kitchen table with her sleeves rolled above her wrists, pressing dough with the heels of her hands. Outside, snow had buried the lower fence rails. Inside, the stove burned hot enough to warm the floorboards. "Coffee is ready," she said. Beside his cup lay 2 eggs and a slice of yesterday's bread fried in bacon grease. Elias ate, put on his coat, and went out before sunrise. At noon, he found a tin pail hanging from the saddle peg inside the barn. It held biscuits wrapped in cloth, a wedge of cheese, and an apple cut into quarters. A small jar of coffee had been stopped with a cork and wrapped in wool to keep it warm. He carried the empty pail back that evening and set it beside the sink. "Enough?" Mara asked. "Plenty." The following day, he returned it with the apple core removed and the cloth folded square. So began the shape of their winter. Mara rose before Elias, but never called him to breakfast. At 5:30, she placed his cup near the stove. At 6, she set down a plate. If he was late, she covered it with an upturned pie tin to hold the warmth. Elias brought in wood before she asked. He left the straight pieces near the kitchen stove because they split cleanly. The knotted pieces went upstairs, where the smaller fire could burn slowly through the night. On Mondays, she washed clothes. On Tuesdays, she baked enough bread for several days. On Wednesdays, she swept the upstairs hall and stopped at the closed doors without opening them. She treated those rooms as she treated Elias's silences, as things belonging to him that did not require her curiosity. That courtesy unsettled him more than questions might have. Mara owned 2 dresses for work, one brown and one faded green. At night, she brushed mud from the hems and hung them beside the stove in her room. Elias noticed the green dress had a torn pocket. 2 days later, he saw a spool of matching thread beside her plate. He had bought it in Dry Creek and left it there without a word. Mara looked at the spool, then at him. You remembered the color. Close enough. The pocket was mended by morning. In December, the cold deepened. Frost grew in fern shapes on the windows. Cattle crowded the windbreak, and the horses' whiskers turned white before breakfast. Elias spent long hours hauling hay into the lower pasture. One evening he returned with blood frozen across the knuckles of his right hand. A gate chain had slipped and torn the skin. Mara saw it while he was reaching for the coffee pot. Sit? It is nothing. Then sitting will do it no harm. He sat. She warmed water, washed the cuts, and wrapped his hand in clean linen. Her touch was careful, but not timid. When he flinched, she loosened the cloth. Too tight? No. She tied the knot and went back to the stove. The next morning, his gloves lay beside his breakfast. The torn lining had been patched with soft wool. Elias wore them into the fields. Christmas came beneath a sky so clear the stars looked close enough to strike the roof. No visitors crossed the frozen roads. Tomas remained with his wife and sons at the North Place. Dry Creek's church bell could not be heard across the miles. Mara made a small supper from what they had. Roast chicken, carrots cooked with honey, and a pie filled with dried apples. She placed a sprig of pine in a jar at the center of the table. Elias came in after dark carrying a narrow parcel wrapped in brown paper. For the kitchen, he said. Inside was a set of 3 wooden spoons, smooth and pale, each carved from maple. The old spoon had split down the middle a week earlier. Mara ran her thumb along one polished handle. These are too fine for stirring beans. Beans will not know. Her laugh was quiet and brief. It changed the room. After supper, she gave him a pair of heavy socks knitted from gray wool. For the ranch, she said. The ranch thanks you. He wore them the next day. January brought a blizzard that erased the hills and turned the yard into moving white. Elias tied a rope between the porch and barn, so neither of them would lose the way. Mara stayed inside, keeping the stove fed and soup simmering. Wind packed snow beneath the doors. Near midnight, a mare began to labor early. Elias pulled on his coat. Mara was already tying a scarf around her hair. You stay here, he said. You may need another pair of hands. It is 40 below. Then we should not leave her waiting. They followed the rope through the storm. Inside the barn, lantern light shook across the stalls. The mare lay sweating in the straw, eyes wide. For 2 hours, Elias worked beside her while Mara held the lantern, warmed blankets, and spoke in a low voice that seemed meant for both man and animal. The foal arrived weak but breathing. Elias rubbed its narrow body until it lifted its head. Mara knelt on the other side, her cheeks red with cold and loose strands of hair stuck to her face. When the foal finally stood, they both laughed. Not loudly. The storm took most of the sound. Back at the house, Mara's hands shook too badly to unbutton her coat. Elias knelt and pulled the frozen laces from her boots. He set them near the fire, then poured 2 cups of coffee. They sat at the kitchen table until dawn. Neither spoke. They listened to the wind and knew something small had survived it. After that night, the silences between them changed. They no longer felt like locked doors. They felt like the pauses in a familiar piece of music. Mara began leaving the kitchen door open when she worked. Elias sometimes sat at the table repairing tack while she kneaded dough. On clear Sundays, they walked to the barn together to see the foal. Mara named her Tempest. Elias claimed it was a foolish name and used it every day. In February, he built a shelf beneath the window in Mara's room after noticing her 4 books stacked on the floor. One was a worn school primer with a child's name inside. He did not ask about it. In March, the sun returned strength to the valley. Snow slid from the barn roof in heavy sheets. Water ran under the ice along Bitter Creek. The first lark called from a fence post. Mara opened the upstairs windows and washed the curtains. Elias repaired the broken wagon and replaced the splintered wheel. Neither mentioned that the roads would soon be passable or that winter employment had an end. On the first Saturday in April, Elias placed her wages on the table as usual. Mara counted the coins, wrapped them in cloth, and tucked them into her dress pocket. Her movements were slower than usual. "Do you still need a cook through summer?" she asked. Elias looked toward the window. New grass showed along the south wall. "If she wishes to stay." Mara nodded. "She does." That afternoon, Elias opened the parlor shutters for the first time in years. Spring spread work across the ranch. Mara planted onions, beans, squash, and potatoes. Elias mended irrigation ditches and rode the calving pastures until dusk. She proved poor at milking and good with frightened horses. In return, she taught him to make biscuits that did not resemble river stones. One warm evening, they carried the sheet from the parlor piano and shook it in the yard. Dust rose gold in the setting sun. Mara wiped the keys and pressed one softly. The note sounded thin but true. "Do you play?" Elias asked. "A little." She played an old hymn. Elias remained in the doorway with his hat in his hands. On the piano stood the walnut table. Its drawer was still closed. The trouble arrived 3 days later in a polished black buggy. The man driving it wore a city coat despite the heat. His name was Silas Rourke, and he introduced himself as an agent for a bank in Cheyenne. He asked for Mara Ellison before he acknowledged Elias. Mara came out onto the porch. The color left her face. "You were difficult to find, Mrs. Ellison," Rourke said. Elias felt the title settle between them. Mara gripped the porch rail. "What do you want?" "The balance owed by your late husband's estate." "There is no estate." "There is a note bearing his signature and yours." "I never signed his note." Rourke opened a leather case and removed a folded paper. Mara looked at the bottom of it without taking it. "That is not my hand." "A judge may disagree." Rourke explained that Mara's husband, Daniel, had borrowed money to purchase a freight wagon and team. He died the previous summer when the wagon overturned in a flooded crossing. The team was lost. The bank had taken their rented home's contents, but the debt remained. Mara had fled east, then north, working in kitchens under her married name. Rourke had followed because the bank's owner believed examples were useful. "She earns wages here," Rourke said to Elias. "I will obtain an order attaching them." "You can speak to her," Elias replied. "She is standing in front of you." Rourke smiled without warmth. "Then I will return with the sheriff." When the buggy disappeared beyond the gate, Mara went inside. Elias found her upstairs packing the brown dress into her trunk. "What are you doing?" Leaving before he makes trouble for you. He already made it." She folded the green dress and placed it on top. "The signature is false, but Daniel often used my name. I knew he borrowed money. I did not know how much. I should have told you." "Why did you not?" Her hands stopped. "Because every place I went, the debt arrived after me. People looked at me as if I had carried it in on my shoes. I wanted one winter where I was useful before I became a burden." Elias looked at the open trunk. The blue pitcher stood on the washstand. 4 books rested on the shelf he had built. "The road is mud," he said. "I can walk to Dry Creek." "No. Mr. Ward, the sheriff can bring his paper here. Until then, supper is at 6. He went downstairs. He heard no movement above for a long time. At 6, Mara entered the kitchen. The trunk remained upstairs, but the old caution returned between them. Mara stopped playing the piano. She worked later and ate faster. Elias rode into Dry Creek twice in 1 week and did not explain why. At night, he sat at the table studying copies of county records and old newspapers. Rourke returned with Sheriff Bell on a rainy Monday. The sheriff removed his hat on the porch and looked ashamed. "I have an attachment order," he said. "It covers Mrs. Ellison's wages until the disputed note is satisfied." "Disputed?" Elias asked. "That is what she claims." "That is what I know," Mara said from the doorway. Rourke looked past her into the house. "There may also be property purchased with concealed funds." Mara's face hardened. "I arrived with 1 trunk. Then we will inventory it." Elias stepped between Rourke and the door. "No." The sheriff shifted his weight. "Elias, do not turn this into something it is not. The order says wages. It does not say her room." Rourke's eyes narrowed at the last 2 words. "Her room?" Elias did not move. Rain tapped the porch roof. Behind him, Mara stood very still. Sheriff Bell read the paper again and cleared his throat. "He is right. We are done here for today." Rourke left with the week's $8 and a promise to return. That evening, Mara set an empty plate before Elias. Then she leaned both hands on the table. "You cannot give him my wages every week. It is your money. I owe you for room and board if I am not being paid." "That was included in the agreement." "An agreement requires wages." Elias put down his fork. "What do you want me to do?" "Let me go." The words were quiet. They struck harder than shouting would have. Elias looked at the table between them. One of the maple spoons rested beside the stove. His mended gloves hung from a peg. Ordinary things, each carrying the mark of her hands. "Is that what you want?" he asked. Mara stared at the empty plate. "It is what causes you the least harm." "That is not what I asked." She lifted her eyes. "No." Elias nodded. "Then do not ask me to pretend it is." The next morning he rode to Dry Creek before breakfast. For 3 weeks the matter dragged through court. Elias hired Amos Reed, a lawyer whose coat shone at the elbows and whose mind missed little. Mara gave a handwriting sample. The clerk who witnessed Daniel's loan admitted she had not been present, but Rourke produced a man who swore she had been. The town began to talk. Some said Mara had trapped a lonely rancher. Others said Elias had lost sense enough to pay another man's debts for the pleasure of a warm supper. At the mercantile, conversation stopped when he entered. Elias bought flour, coffee, lamp oil, and green thread. He placed his coins on the counter and left without answering anyone. Mara heard the talk too. She went into town only once. When she returned, she carried herself straight, but her eyes were red from dust that had not been blowing. That night, She moved her trunk from the spare room to the upstairs landing. Elias found it there after supper. "Put it back," he said. "If the judge rules against me, Rourke may take what is inside. Then he can carry the whole house while he is at it. This is not your fight." Elias placed one hand on the trunk lid. "My wife, Anna, died in that room." Mara said nothing. It was the first time he had spoken her name in years. "Our daughter died there 2 days before her," he continued. "Fever. Ruth came to help, but there was nothing to be done. Afterward, my sister stayed through the winter. She tried to keep the house alive. I made it so cold she left in spring." The wind moved softly through the open hall window. Somewhere below, the clock measured the silence. Elias looked toward the spare room door. "When you said you could sleep in the barn, I almost let you. A bed was easier to offer than a place in my life. So I told myself that was all it was." Mara's fingers tightened around the trunk handle. "What is it now?" He answered plainly. "Your room." She looked at him, waiting. "Your shelf. Your pitcher. Your fire," he said. "You are not sleeping in a barn. You are not walking to town. You are not leaving because another man wrote your name on a lie." Mara's chin trembled once. She steadied it. "And if the judge believes him? Then we face what comes through the gate. We, if you will." She stood beside the trunk for a long while. Then she lifted one end. Elias took the other. Together, they carried it back into the room. 2 days later, Amos Reed arrived after dark with mud to his knees and triumph hidden poorly beneath his tired face. He had found the original loan ledger in a box of bank records. Beside Mara's forged signature was a notation in the former manager's hand. Daniel Ellison had pledged the wagon, team, and freight earnings as sole security. No spousal guarantee had been witnessed. Worse for Rourke, the bank had already collected insurance on the lost team and wagon, then concealed the payment while continuing to pursue Mara. The attachment order was withdrawn. The judge referred the matter to the territorial prosecutor. Rourke did not return to Ward Ranch. On the first Saturday after the ruling, Elias placed $8 beside Mara's plate. Then he added the $24 Rourke had taken. Mara counted the coins. "There is too much. Interest." "You are a poor banker. I aim to remain one." She smiled and wrapped the money in cloth. Summer came green and bright to Bitter Creek. Tempest ran in the pasture on long, uncertain legs. Beans climbed the poles behind the house. The cottonwoods filled with leaves, and the wind that had once scraped the valley clean now carried the smell of sage and warm earth through open windows. Mara's room remained at the end of the hall, but its door was no longer kept closed. Sometimes music drifted from the parlor after supper. Sometimes Elias sat beside the piano, not speaking, while the last light moved across the floor. One evening in August, Mara found him repairing the porch step. Beside him lay a small brass plate and 2 nails. He held it out to her. M. Ellison had been stamped into the metal in neat letters. "For the door," he said. Mara turned the plate over in her hand. "So visitors know where the cook sleeps. So no one mistakes it for a spare room." She sat beside him on the step. Their shoulders touched. "Elias." It was the first time she had used his given name. He looked at her. "I could stay after summer," she said, "if the work remains." He glanced toward the garden, the barn, and the window above them where the blue pitcher caught a piece of sunset. "There will be work. And after winter?" Elias set down the hammer. "There will be spring." Mara placed her hand over his. Her palm was warm and roughened from the garden. Elias turned his hand beneath it and held on. They sat that way while the light faded from the fields. Before bed, Elias fixed the brass plate to her door. Mara stood beside him holding the lamp. When the second nail was set, he tested the plate with his thumb. It did not move. Downstairs, the kitchen stove had burned low. Outside, Tempest called once from the pasture, and the mare answered from the barn. Mara closed the upstairs window against the cooling air. Elias added a piece of wood to her fire. Then they stepped into the hall together, leaving the room warm behind them and the door open to the light.